In the final spring of the war, a truck crawled across the gray roads of Berlin, its engine coughing smoke into the ruined air. Inside, a small group of soldiers sat in silence, faces pale, eyes hollow, uniforms stiff with dried mud. They had once believed in victory. Now they were only waiting for the end. The city they passed through no longer looked like home. Streets where children once played were now rivers of ash. The air carried the bitter stench of burning fuel and damp concrete. Every few minutes, the ground trembled, another shell, another building gone. Deep underground, beneath the wreckage of what was once the Reich Chancellery, a door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the narrow concrete halls. Behind that door sat the man they still called Führer. He was smaller than they remembered, shoulders hunched, one hand trembling slightly as he leaned over a table covered in maps. Lines, arrows, promises, all meaningless now. Around him the walls hummed faintly from the impact of Soviet artillery. Dust drifted from the ceiling like slow-falling snow. No one spoke unless spoken to. The air was thick, not with smoke but with something heavier. Denial. Fear. The smell of sweat, old papers, and exhaustion filled the bunker. Somewhere above, the world was ending, but down here, time had stopped. For days, he refused to believe what his generals told him. That Berlin was surrounded, that his armies no longer existed, that the empire he had built from blood and propaganda was now just a name whispered by ghosts. Outside, tanks rumbled through the streets. Inside, he stared at a single map, tracing imaginary front lines that no longer existed. In that cramped room beneath a dying city, surrounded by loyalists and shadows, one truth began to settle over them all. The war was lost. But no one dared say it aloud, not yet. The morning light over Texas stretched across the camp like a soft gold mist. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but here, in this remote corner of America, time seemed to move differently. The land was flat and endless, dotted with mesquite trees and long fences that cut the horizon into squares of sunlight and shadow. Beyond them, hundreds of prisoners worked quietly, their German uniforms faded to gray under the southern sun. But on this particular morning, the camp was unusually still. A truck had arrived before dawn, its tires crunching the gravel road that led to the main gate. Inside sat the newest arrivals, captured German Red Cross nurses, taken in France just weeks before the German surrender. They were not soldiers, not exactly, but they had worn the same insignia, served the same cause, and now found themselves on foreign soil, prisoners in a country they'd been taught to fear. When the truck stopped, none of them spoke. They had spent the long journey in silence, listening to the low hum of the engine and the whisper of the wind through the open slats. Every mile carried them farther from the war, and yet closer to its ghosts. As the rear door swung open, sunlight spilled into the truck, sharp and blinding. One by one they stepped down. Their boots touched the warm Texas earth, firm, dry, unfamiliar. Around them stood rows of wooden barracks, a watchtower, and a handful of guards with rifles slung over their shoulders. But there was no shouting, no threats, no hatred in the men's faces. Just curiosity. At first, the nurses didn't believe it. Everything they had been told, about the Americans, about what happened to captured Germans, had been built on fear. They expected humiliation, maybe violence, but instead they were met with order, calm, and an odd kind of decency. One of the guards, a young man with sunburned skin and a slow Texas drawl, offered a simple greeting. "Morning, ladies," he said, almost awkwardly, tipping his hat. For a moment they just stared at him, unsure if it was a trick. The camp commandant appeared next. He was middle-aged, tall, and carried himself with quiet authority. He didn't shout orders. He spoke plainly, explaining that they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would be housed in their own quarters, given medical duties in the camp infirmary, and allowed to write home. It sounded impossible. One of the nurses, a woman named Elizabeth, couldn't stop looking at the American flag fluttering above the command post. In Germany, that flag had always been a symbol of destruction, carried by bombers that turned cities into rubble. But here, under the bright sky, it looked different. Still powerful, yes, but calm. like it belonged to another world entirely. Later that day, they were escorted to the mess hall. The air inside was thick with the smell of frying bacon, hot biscuits, and coffee. It hit them like a memory they didn't know they still had. Warm kitchens, family breakfasts, the laughter that used to fill their homes before the war stole everything away. At first, they refused to eat. Pride held their hands still. But hunger has its own will. When they finally took their first bites, something inside them cracked, not just from relief, but confusion. How could the enemy feed them like this? Days passed. The nurses began their assigned work in the infirmary, tending to both German and American patients. The Americans watched them carefully at first, but soon realized these women were not dangerous, just tired, frightened, and far from home. Elizabeth spent her mornings cleaning wounds and changing bandages on captured soldiers. Some were barely older than boys. Others had faces so haunted that no medicine could reach them. At night, she sat on her bunk and wrote letters to no one, words she would never send. The guards started to talk to them. Not about politics, not about the war, but about ordinary things, weather, food, family. Slowly, something human began to form between both sides. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the camp in shades of orange and dust, an American soldier approached Elizabeth while she was sitting outside. He held 2 tin cups of coffee. "Ma'am," he said, gently handing her one. She hesitated, then took it. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Then he spoke again. "You miss home?" She didn't answer right away. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "Yes, but I don't know if home still exists." He looked at her then, not as an enemy, but as another soul who'd seen too much. "Maybe that's something we both understand," he said softly. That night, long after the lights went out, Elizabeth lay awake. The distant hum of crickets filled the air. For the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not peace, not comfort, but perhaps the faintest trace of hope. The world she had known was gone. The Reich had fallen. But here, in the middle of a Texas camp, surrounded by strangers who were supposed to hate her, Elizabeth realized something unexpected. The war might have taken everything, but it hadn't yet taken her humanity. The days in the camp settled into a strange rhythm. Dawn brought the smell of coffee and eggs, the clatter of pans and the low murmur of guards as they went about their rounds. The German nurses were given quarters in a long wooden barracks, small but clean, with thin mattresses and neatly folded blankets. It was nothing like the mud-soaked field hospitals they had tended on the front lines, where rations were scraps and disease ran unchecked. Here, every day seemed to offer a small miracle. Linen sheets, steaming meals, and an abundance of medicine that made Elizabeth pause in disbelief. At first, the nurses moved cautiously through their routines, wary of every gesture, every glance from the guards, but slowly the absurdity of their situation began to sink in. They were prisoners, yes, but treated not with cruelty, but with discipline and an almost methodical fairness. Soldiers walked past, rifles in hand, but their eyes did not burn with hatred. Orders were spoken clearly, commands followed by polite explanations. They were being controlled, yes, but with efficiency rather than malice. Meals became the first marker of this strange normality. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner arrived like clockwork. A tin tray filled with eggs, bread, and bacon seemed almost excessive after years of subsisting on meager rations. One nurse, Hilda, remembered gripping the strip of bacon as if it were a relic, amazed that it could exist outside the bounds of wartime scarcity. She whispered to a companion, "This can't be real." And yet each morning the plates came, each one a quiet defiance of the war that raged far away in Europe. Letters were next. Though they were censored, the act of writing home became a small act of rebellion against fear. The women poured their thoughts onto paper, carefully knowing that everything they wrote could be read by someone else. Marta, her hands still shaking from the first tin cup of coffee, wrote about the simple absurdity of it all, the abundance, the warmth, the astonishing ordinariness of life behind barbed wire. She didn't dare write the full truth, only fragments that would hint at the contradictions surrounding them. Even work inside the camp carried a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had left behind. The infirmary was modest, but every supply, gauze, bandages, disinfectants, even vials of penicillin, was plentiful. Elizabeth often lingered near the shelves, incredulous that such medicine existed in quantities that Germany had once hoarded like treasure. Each bottle, each carefully stacked roll of cotton, reminded them of the world outside the front lines, a world they had been told did not exist. Small moments punctuated the days, moments that forced the nurses to rethink everything they had been taught. One afternoon, while helping fold freshly laundered sheets, Elizabeth watched a black American soldier walk past with a clipboard. She froze for a moment, remembering the lies about inferiority, about who should serve whom. Yet here he walked with authority, speaking to the prisoners with calm command. It was not just an observation of authority, but a confrontation with truth. The guards themselves were a puzzle. Some were distant, clearly uninterested in conversation. A few spat curses under their breath, quietly asserting their own small indignation. But the majority enforced the rules without cruelty, correcting mistakes with measured words rather than physical punishment. Discipline existed, yes, but without the sadistic edge that had been the constant in the Reich hospitals. One day, Marta's torn sleeve caught a guard's attention. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a sewing kit, simply handing it to her. "Fix it," he said. "No scolding, no mockery, just practical help." The gesture unsettled her more than any insult could have. Evenings were quieter, a time for reflection and whispered conversations. The nurses would gather around their bunks, sharing stories of home, memories of meals before the war, or the letters they had received that morning. Erica laughed softly one night, remembering her first breakfast in America. "Imagine," she said, "our first memory of this country is bacon." The irony made them smile, though a shadow of guilt lingered in the corners of their minds. They ate better here than many of their families back in Germany. Rumors moved through the camp as quickly as the wind stirred the dust. Prisoners spoke of men in other states allowed to work on farms, to earn wages, even to attend movies on weekends. At first, the nurses dismissed these stories, thinking them exaggerations meant to ease captivity. But glimpses of reality soon confirmed them. They began to understand that the rules here were not arbitrary cruelty, but a system built on order, efficiency, and a surprising humanity. Through all this, a subtle tension remained, the awareness that they were still prisoners, still captives behind barbed wire. Each day, each small kindness, challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. Was this the cruelty they had feared, or something far more disarming? A system so confident in its own power that it could afford decency. By the end of the week, the German nurses moved through their new world with a fragile blend of awe and caution. They cleaned wounds, folded linens, served meals, and wrote letters. They learned the sound of the mess hall in the morning, the way the sun glinted off the windows of the infirmary, and the subtle patterns of the guards' steps. Life here was regimented, yes, but it was predictable, and for the first time in years, predictability felt like a blessing rather than a trap. Each evening, as the Texas sun sank below the horizon, Elizabeth and her companions would lie awake listening to the distant shouts of guards and the low hum of the wind through the fences. They were prisoners, yes, but a different kind of prisoner, one who could feel hunger, fear, and gratitude at the same time. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new question began to take root in their minds. If life here could exist in abundance, if order could coexist with fairness, then what else about the world had been hidden from them? Inside the camp, the infirmary was a revelation. The German nurses had expected something makeshift, a hastily patched-together room with tattered supplies, the faint smell of blood and decay clinging to the air. Instead, they stepped into a space that smelled sharply of disinfectant, clean linens, and alcohol swabs. A smell so sterile it made Elizabeth stop in her tracks. Shelves were stacked meticulously with gauze rolls, cotton pads, glass bottles of medicine, and instruments that gleamed under the flickering lights. In one corner, a refrigerated cabinet held vials of penicillin, an antibiotic so rare in Germany that it was treated like treasure, usually reserved for the highest-ranking officers. Here it was available in abundance like water in a well. Hilda's eyes widened. She had spent months sewing wounds shut with nothing but rags, improvising bandages from torn sheets, praying that infections wouldn't claim her patients. And, now standing in front of row upon row of medical supplies, she whispered to herself, "My God, they have more here than we had for an entire division." Every nurse paused, silently comparing what they saw to the collapsed hospitals and empty storerooms left behind in Europe. The contrast was staggering. Assignments came quickly, but with a calm efficiency that disarmed the German nurses. They were asked to assist with basic care, changing sheets, cleaning equipment, preparing supplies, and helping in routine procedures under the guidance of American staff. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was improvised. Every instruction was precise, delivered in measured tones, firm but without cruelty. Margaret, a tall American nurse with auburn hair, noticed the way the German women's eyes lingered on the shelves. "You will help here. No shortages, no excuses," she said slowly, deliberately. Then she handed a box of bandages to Elizabeth and gestured to a bed where a prisoner lay recovering from pneumonia. It was work, yes, but it was also a window into a world of abundance they had never imagined. Each day, as they folded linens or disinfected instruments, the German nurses began to understand the scale of America's war effort. Factories kept producing. Supplies flowed without apparent end. Penicillin was lined up like bottles in a pantry, ready for anyone in need, whether soldier or prisoner. Marta whispered to Erica one afternoon, "Why do they have so much? Don't they need it all at the front?" The American medic simply shrugged, his voice casual, almost indifferent. "Factories keep making it. There's more than enough." The words stunned Marta. In Germany, factories lay in rubble, machines silent, resources scarce beyond comprehension. It wasn't just the abundance that shocked them. It was the attitude behind it. The staff expected work to be done correctly, yes, but there was no malice in the corrections. One older American doctor asked the German nurses about conditions back home, curious, not accusatory. Hilda answered softly, "Worse than you think," and the doctor merely nodded, not with judgment but with quiet acknowledgement. There was no gloating, no triumphalism. It was a simple exchange of fact, a recognition of suffering, and a willingness to provide help where it could. Even the simplest tasks highlighted the contrast. Folding freshly laundered sheets, Elizabeth noticed the precision and orderliness of every routine. Beds were made with care, instruments sterilized meticulously, bandages stocked so that none would ever be needed to be reused. It was as though every act of preparation carried a hidden message. Life mattered, and every small detail was proof of that belief. Dialogue occasionally broke the silence of labor. One day, while assisting with routine care, Marta asked a young American medic why the camp offered prisoners so much food when rationing existed back home. The nurse paused, then replied, "Because the Geneva rules say we must, and because if our boys are captured, we'd want the same." Her tone was practical, almost indifferent, yet the weight of her words lingered. It was a lesson in decency, framed as duty rather than sentiment. Elizabeth repeated the phrase under her breath as she folded sheets later that evening, feeling the slow burn of revelation. Evenings were quiet in the infirmary. The German nurses would sit on the edge of their bunks, whispering about what they had seen. "Do you understand?" Hilda asked one night, voice barely audible. "They treat every soldier, every prisoner like life still matters." Marta shook her head, trying to reconcile what she had seen with everything she had been taught. "Maybe it's all for show," she muttered. "Maybe they want us to talk about it when we go home." And yet, the abundance was real. No pretense could conjure shelves stocked with supplies Germany could not imagine. Anger sometimes flared quietly, directed inward toward the leaders they had trusted. How could they have been told that Americans were savages, while here, decency and efficiency ruled? How could Germany promise strength, yet deliver ruin, while America seemed capable of providing for both its soldiers and its captives? The contradictions gnawed at the nurses, forcing them to reconsider everything they had known about war, leadership, and morality. By the end of their first week in the infirmary, a subtle transformation had taken root. The German nurses moved with more confidence, knowing the routines, understanding the supplies, and witnessing the care given to every patient. They were still prisoners, still captives of war, but the sense of dread that had accompanied them across the American plains was slowly replaced by cautious curiosity, awe, and an unexpected respect for the system surrounding them. And as they worked day by day, folding linens, washing instruments, and assisting with care, one thought lingered like a quiet hum. In a world built on destruction and fear, here was a place where order, efficiency, and a measure of humanity had created something unexpected, a war zone where life still mattered. Life inside the camp stretched beyond the routines of the infirmary and mess hall. The German nurses soon discovered that captivity wasn't defined solely by confinement, but by a series of small, persistent contradictions that challenged everything they had been taught. The first moments of disorientation came during roll call. Lined up under the wide Texas sky, the women waited tensely, expecting the familiar sharp commands and cold stares they had been trained to anticipate. Yet when the guards approached, calm authority replaced anger. Measured words replaced threats. Among them stood a black American soldier, uniform pressed, posture upright, and voice firm as he read names aloud. The German nurses exchanged quick, almost fearful glances. In Nazi Germany, they had been fed endless lies about race, ideas of inferiority, incapacity, and servitude ingrained from childhood. And yet here was a black man commanding the same respect as any white counterpart. When a prisoner stumbled over her name, he corrected her gently without malice, his tone simply efficient. The encounter left the nurses speechless, forcing them to question the rigid hierarchy of beliefs that had shaped their upbringing. The infirmary offered another lesson. One of the black nurses returned to check on a German POW suffering from fever. Her hands were steady, her movements confident, and her voice calm and gentle as she instructed Hilda to fetch fresh linens. Hilda obeyed, pausing afterward, unsettled by her instinct to defer. "Everything they taught us about race, it was all lies," she whispered later to Erica. Erica hesitated, then admitted softly, "It must have been." The realization was disorienting. Authority, competence, and care were not bound by the prejudices they had been taught. These Americans treated them, and each other, as people first. Even the guards' behavior defied expectations. Firm and disciplined, they enforced the rules, but they did not lash out without reason. There was a quiet professionalism in their enforcement, a distinction between authority and cruelty that was almost foreign to the nurses. Sundays brought optional chaplain services. The hymns, sung in English or Swedish, filled the hall with a strange, comforting normalcy. Some of the nurses admitted that these moments reminded them of childhood churches, before propaganda and war had overshadowed simple faith and community. Small gestures compounded the sense of moral confusion. One afternoon, Marta, noticing a torn hem on her uniform sleeve, found a guard returning with a sewing kit. "Fix it," he said simply, handing it over without condescension or judgment. The simplicity of the act stunned her, and that evening she told the others, voice carrying disbelief and muted anger, "They treat us like people." For the first time, kindness felt like both an insult and a revelation, a contradiction that gnawed at their certainty about the enemy. Not all encounters were pleasant. Some guards maintained distance, spitting the word Nazi under their breath, faces hard and disapproving. Yet these instances were overshadowed by the daily rhythm of respectful, measured interaction. Dialogue crept into unexpected places, during laundry, while folding sheets in the infirmary or carrying supplies from one building to another. Questions emerged, whispered with uncertainty. Why was so much food provided? Why did supplies flow so freely? And why did Americans seem capable of order without cruelty? The practical explanations offered clarity, if not comfort. One nurse explained that the Geneva Conventions required proper care for prisoners, and because the Americans would want the same treatment for their soldiers if captured. The rationale was grounded in rules and reciprocity rather than sentimentality, yet its effect was profound. It highlighted the vast moral chasm between what the German nurses had been taught to expect and the reality of their daily life in Texas. Letters arriving from Germany intensified the moral contradictions. One nurse received a note from her sister in Hamburg describing bombed-out streets, children so malnourished their bones were visible through skin, and the desperate queues for meager rations. Reading the words while holding a plate of eggs and bacon made her feel a hollow guilt. "We eat better as prisoners than our families do at home," she whispered, voice trembling. The dissonance between comfort and duty, abundance and survival weighed heavily on every woman. Rumors from other camps added to the confusion. Some claimed that male POWs were allowed to work on American farms, even receiving wages. Others reported movies being shown on weekends, music drifting across yards, and small liberties extended in ways the German nurses could barely believe. Each story challenged the rigid narratives they had been taught, that Americans were savage, decadent, cruel. It was a world where captivity did not mean degradation, but an enforced, uneasy normalcy that pressed against all previous convictions. By the end of their first weeks, the German nurses began to recognize a pattern. Life in the camp operated on principles foreign to them, principles rooted in order, fairness, and pragmatic decency. Each encounter, from a black soldier giving roll call to small acts of kindness by the guards, chipped away at the propaganda they carried. Fear remained, as did the barbed wire, but beneath it, confusion, curiosity, and cautious respect began to grow. They were prisoners, yes, but they were learning a new language, the language of human decency, of competence divorced from prejudice, of survival that did not require cruelty. And in that language, the contradictions of race, authority, and morality became a quiet, persistent revelation. In the weeks to come, these lessons would deepen, forcing the German nurses to reconsider not just the war, but the very nature of the world they had been taught to fear. The arrival of letters from home brought a quiet, heavy tension to the camp. Each envelope carried fragments of a life the German nurses had left behind, a world ravaged by war, starvation, and despair. The women tore them open with trembling hands, knowing the words inside would bring both relief and heartache. For Hilda, the letter from her mother in Hamburg painted a vivid picture of destruction. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble, families standing in endless lines for bread stretched so thin it crumbled at the touch. Children were pale and skeletal, their bones visible beneath the skin, yet alive through sheer will. Holding her plate of breakfast, eggs, bread, a strip of bacon, Hilda felt a wave of guilt wash over her. The contrast between life in the camp and the suffering at home was unbearable. She whispered to herself, "We eat better as prisoners than our families do at home." The words were hollow, yet undeniable. Every bite carried the weight of survival for herself and the burden of her family's deprivation. Other nurses experienced similar pangs of conscience. One wept quietly after reading that her younger brother had been conscripted at 16. Another learned that her father had collapsed from exhaustion after months of back-breaking labor in a munitions factory. The letters forced a reckoning, not just with physical reality, but with the moral contradictions of war. Here, behind barbed wire and under constant supervision, the nurses were treated with dignity. Food appeared every morning. Fresh linens were provided. Medicine was abundant, and even minor comforts. A clean cup, a pillow, a patching kit for torn uniforms were granted with care. Yet the guilt gnawed at them. How could the enemy feed them so well while their families starved? How could their supposed captors maintain humanity and order when the world outside crumbled? The daily rhythm of the camp seemed designed to amplify these contradictions. Mornings began with the clatter of dishes and the aroma of frying eggs, bacon, and coffee. The smell, once shocking, now became a constant reminder of abundance that should not exist in a war-torn world. The nurses carried plates to their bunks, stealing small moments of quiet as they balanced gratitude with guilt. They shared the letters among themselves, reading passages aloud with hushed voices, and the barracks became a space of whispered debates and silent reflection. Rumors circulating through the camp complicated matters further. Some nurses claimed that male prisoners in other states were allowed to work on farms and receive wages. Others had heard music drifting across the yards during weekend screenings of American movies. Each story defied their expectations of captivity, yet each revelation carried an undercurrent of confusion. Could the enemy truly be capable of such generosity? Or was it a calculated attempt to soften the reality of confinement? The uncertainty fed both hope and suspicion, tension coiling around every gesture of normalcy. Hilda spent hours pondering the letters, memorizing each detail of her mother's words. The city reduced to rubble, the endless queues for bread, the pale faces of children, all etched into her memory. At night she would stare at her thin mattress, the sheets crisp and clean, and wonder how she could reconcile these two worlds. The guilt of comfort pressed down like a physical weight. To eat without shame seemed impossible. Yet to ignore the care provided by her captors felt like an affront to the truth she had just witnessed. Other nurses struggled in similar ways. One young woman held a letter describing her brother's forced labor in a factory, reading it over and over while tears streaked her face. Another traced the words of her mother, who described rationed meals, frostbitten nights, and endless worry for the future. The contrast between survival in the camp and survival at home was nearly unbearable. The comfort of clean beds, warm meals, and abundant medicine was constant, yet it amplified the harsh reality awaiting them in Germany. Amidst this turmoil, the nurses began to understand the subtle power of perception. They were prisoners, yes, but the treatment they received challenged everything they had been taught to believe about America. The food, the beds, the letters, the daily routines, none of it erased their captivity, but it blurred the lines between enemy and ally. In quiet moments, they questioned the narratives fed to them from childhood, that Americans were cruel, decadent, and unfeeling. Instead, they saw order, discipline, and a level of care that had become foreign in war-torn Europe. Writing letters back home became a delicate act of conscience. Every word was censored, every sentence scrutinized, yet the women still tried to communicate truth without jeopardizing their situation. Hilda carefully composed her letters, noting the safety, food, and small comforts, but omitting details she feared might be misunderstood. Others hesitated, wanting to speak of the incongruities they observed, the cleanliness, the abundance, the surprising humanity, but feared it would sound like betrayal or disbelief. Even as guilt weighed on them, the daily routine offered a strange kind of solace. Each meal, each clean sheet, each ordered supply of medicine was a quiet affirmation that life could continue, even in the shadow of war. Yet the letters from home were constant reminders that the world beyond the camp remained fractured, hungry, and desperate. The nurses lived in two realities at once, one of immediate comfort and surprising dignity, the other of distant suffering and unrelenting scarcity. Through it all, confusion and gratitude intertwined. The nurses could not fully reconcile the abundance offered by their captors with the devastation at home. They felt shame for eating, for resting, for surviving while others endured starvation. Yet they also recognized the humanity that existed within the camp, a stark contrast to the despair they had fled. Each letter, each meal, each small act of kindness forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy they had feared was capable of more decency than those who had promised them protection. In the quiet of the evening, the women gathered in small clusters, sharing letters, stories, and whispered fears. The barbed wire remained, the restrictions were real, and yet a sense of moral dissonance lingered in the air. It was not simply survival they were processing. It was the revelation that human decency could exist in the most unexpected places. They were prisoners, yes, but they were learning that captivity could also be a lesson. In patience, in observation, and in confronting the stark contradictions of war. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of camp life settled into a predictable pattern. Mornings brought breakfast, the smell of frying eggs, bacon, and coffee filling the air, followed by orderly routines in the infirmary, the barracks, or the mess hall. Slowly, the German nurses adjusted to this unexpected structure. They were still prisoners, but the shock of initial captivity had given way to a new awareness. Life behind the barbed wire was not built on cruelty, but on control, discipline, and an almost disarming respect for basic human dignity. With each passing day, the nurses observed and absorbed the contradictions of their surroundings. Guards maintained authority but seldom cruelty. Soldiers were firm but fair, carrying out their duties with precision rather than malice. The American nurses, young and competent, treated them not as enemies, but as colleagues in the shared tasks of healing and caretaking. The abundance of supplies, the regularity of meals, and the cleanliness of the camp were constant reminders that this world operated under principles they had not anticipated. For some, this understanding bred quiet frustration. How had they been misled for so long? How could their own propaganda have painted an entire nation as savage and barbaric, when these simple acts of care revealed a different reality? Marta, who had first laughed in disbelief at the strip of bacon on her plate, now paused when observing the orderly handling of medical supplies, the careful folding of linens, the efficient, almost ritualized way the camp functioned. The efficiency was not a show. It was real, tangible, and impossible to ignore. The letters continued to arrive, each one a tether to the world outside. They brought news of devastation, hunger and loss, but also glimpses of endurance and hope. Hilda read her mother's words over and over, the description of bombed-out streets and rationed bread etched deeply into her memory. Each note from home reinforced the contrast between life in the camp and the suffering of those they loved. It was impossible to ignore. They were safe, fed, clothed, and healthy, while the world outside their fences struggled to survive. The weight of guilt and gratitude intertwined with each passing day, leaving them constantly reevaluating the notion of enemy and ally. As the months progressed, small acts of kindness and normality began to accumulate into a deeper, more profound lesson. One afternoon, while folding bandages in the infirmary, Hilda noticed a young German soldier recovering from pneumonia. The American staff treated him with the same care and attention they would have offered any patient. There were no sneers, no reminders of captivity, only consistent professional care. The nurses realized with growing astonishment that life in the camp had its own moral framework, one that contrasted sharply with the chaos and cruelty they had left behind in Germany. Interactions with the guards and American staff became moments of reflection, simple gestures, a sewing kit handed over, a question asked politely, a shared joke, challenged everything they had been taught. Erica, who had initially been suspicious of every act of kindness, now found herself pausing to observe, to understand, and occasionally, to marvel. The barriers of propaganda were slowly crumbling, replaced by a cautious acknowledgement that human behavior could exist outside the rigid, cruel rules of war. The day of departure arrived with little ceremony, yet every nurse felt the weight of anticipation and uncertainty. They were to be transferred to another camp or repatriated back to Europe, and the familiar routines of Texas were about to end. As they packed their few possessions, the memory of every meal, every clean sheet, every letter from home pressed into their minds. They had been prisoners, yes, but prisoners who had witnessed a level of humanity that seemed almost impossible when contrasted with the destruction left behind in Europe. On the final morning, the nurses gathered one last time in the mess hall. The smell of breakfast, eggs, bacon, coffee, filled the air as it had since their arrival. Plates were stacked, tin mugs passed hand to hand, and the small conversations of camaraderie and reflection took place over bites of food. There was laughter, tentative at first, then more certain as they shared stories of first impressions, letters read, and moments that had shaken their beliefs. The irony was not lost. They had come to fear punishment and found comfort. They had come to distrust and discovered decency. As the buses pulled up to take them away, the nurses stepped out into the wide Texas sky one last time. Boots struck gravel and a soft wind carried the scent of breakfast across the yard. They paused, taking in the orderly rows of barracks, the disciplined soldiers, the quiet hum of camp life. For a moment, the full impact of their experience settled over them. They were leaving not just a physical space, but a revelation about the complexity of human behavior, the contrast between propaganda and reality, and the resilience of dignity even in captivity. Hilda, Marta, Erica, and the others climbed onto the bus, looking back at the camp with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering confusion. They had arrived expecting punishment, humiliation, and cruelty. Instead, they had been met with structure, sustenance, and humanity. The lessons of the camp, the abundance, the kindness, the contrast with the suffering at home, would stay with them long after they returned to Europe. They had been prisoners, but they had also been witnesses to a different kind of strength, a strength built not on terror, but on care, order, and respect. The journey back would take them across the vast American plains once more, but now their silence was different. It carried memories of breakfast smells, clean linens, letters from home, and the quiet realization that not all enemies were what they had been taught to fear. Each mile reaffirmed a truth that would linger in their minds for the rest of their lives. Captivity could teach lessons beyond fear, and sometimes the most profound revelations came not through punishment, but through the surprising kindness of strangers. The barracks buzzed with quiet stories. Some men were allowed outside, tending fields, hearing the wind in open spaces. Others watched flickering movies on weekend nights, caught glimpses of a life untouched by war. Each tale, whispered in awe, made the nurses question everything. Was it real? Could Americans really treat captives with a measure of trust, even respect? Every word added tension, hope threading through fear. Behind the gates, the world was still divided by conflict. but these rumors hinted at a fragile truth. Freedom, even fleeting, might exist, waiting for those bold enough to reach for it.